cultures are as likely to meet or exceed financial targets, and 6 times as likely to be innovative and agile. A survey from the firm Korn Ferry found that 84% of respondents said that a lack of attention to diversity and inclusion contributes to employee turnover. And a study found in our office found that companies with chief diversity officers, only 17% were in the C-suite. So we know that there are also some challenges around implementing. But more importantly, diversity of thinking lowers companies' risk by 30%. And I think that's really the bottom line. The numbers do not lie. And so as you're thinking through reasons whether your company should or shouldn't, here's just some very clear-cut facts on why you should be able to move forward. Elena, can you talk a little bit about your experience in that first kind of week in the Comptroller's office as you were looking through resumes or just looking through transactions and understanding now big picture, like why you feel diversity is so important looking back?
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of, a lot of it just goes right back to sort of common sense. Like when you have people who are sort of comfortable in their ways of doing things, there's nothing wrong with that. There's no malice or bad intent, but you sort of get embedded in these routines of how you select vendors or how you hire. And without realizing it, you're preventing the organization from being infused with more creativity, people who challenge groupthink, people who provide that sort of competitiveness and entrepreneurial spirit. And those dynamics help improve society. They help improve the way organizations are run. And we all know this because we've had those experiences in the jobs that we've had. And so I think having new ways of thinking, new ways of approaching old problems is just absolutely critical. And we know this based on the research, but we've lived it. And I think we knew that to really meet that standard, we would have to get at it at every single level of how we function. And, it helps to have a leader and leadership who buys into that. But everyone thinks they buy into that. And so to operationalize it and give a sense of ownership and accountability to the every single day of every single way you operate has been transformational. And I will admit that I didn't exactly know what to expect from this experience. And I have been absolutely convinced that this is a paramount and critical position that should be in every agency, in every department. And it has improved everything that we've tried to accomplish. And so I'm a total believer, and obviously it didn't hurt to have people of Wendy's caliber and the caliber of her team, which is exceptional, but it's been quite an experience and one that I hope to carry with me in whatever we do in the future.
And so we just want to talk a little bit about some industry trends. Chief diversity officers have been a hot topic, especially this year, post-COVID, post-Black Lives Matter. And I just wanted to highlight for all of you how rapidly this industry is growing. Hiring chief diversity officers have tripled just in the last 16 months. In 2021, the CDO role will be the most mission-driven critical function comparable to IT, to business operations, to HR, where 75% of large enterprises are now beginning to start thinking about the implementation of this. You heard Elena say it and how critical it is to have it in every single bureau and every part of the city, but also in the private sector as well, and in arts and in media and entertainment and all these other sectors. You're seeing folks like the Metropolitan Museum, Metropolitan Opera just hired a chief diversity officer. Pearson hired a chief diversity officer, and salaries of CDOs are ranging They were really low in the beginning, not reflecting C-suites. And now you're seeing that it's pushing over 300K. And it's really because private entities are realizing that these positions are positions that at the C-suite level, and they really require cross-operational management and high-level individuals. We talk a lot about how important it is for the Chief Diversity Officer to be operationalized. And many times when you're Googling, what is a Chief Diversity Officer, or what does it do, or where is it going, or even if it's working, you'll see that people just want to know, well, what does a CDO do? And to Elena's point earlier, when you first carve out the role may have a broader view, but not a full operationalized view. So we thought we'll give you some key elements that we feel have been critical and how it's evolved in our own office throughout the years, and some best practices that we found. We believe that a Chief Diversity Officer needs to be having oversight of the diversity of the full operation of your organization, whether that is government or you're in the private sector. That means looking at your boardroom. We've done a lot of work on that. We'll talk a little bit about that a little later. That's your workforce, that's your supply chain, and also the operations and the internal policies of the way things work in the everyday part of the office. For some of you, you may have lawyers that will dictate how the organization has run in the past. Or if you're an agency, you have some charter mandate. And these things are also important for the CDO to look at. So I'm wondering, Elena, could you talk a little bit about the evolution of the role, and maybe give us some examples on your view on the job description for a CDO?
Yeah, I mean, I think a CDO could take different shape depending on the organization. So our experience may not be exactly, what every organization needs. I think for us, the unique nature of what the Comptroller's office does, we are the chief procurement officer for the city. We're analyzing every contract with an outside vendor. And we are, give a very close eye to the purchasing that the city engages in. And so we knew very early on, we wanted to make sure there was true opportunity for minority and women-owned businesses. And that only happens through accountability. So again, like, people can say that they value something, but until you start to measure the improvement and measure the change, that's what really, in our view, helps drive and propel, leaders to do their work differently. And so I think the position in our agency have full ownership of that, that accountability and grading of city agencies, and to what degree they were awarding contracts to minority and women-owned businesses. And then going further, right, and saying, okay, we see that we need to do better, but we need to empower and educate. And this forum is an example of that. We didn't do this MWBE University program year one. It took us time to realize it's not enough just to show people that they need to improve, but we need to empower them and educate and share best practices. And so that's been a very big part of what our Chief Diversity Officer and diversity team works on. But it doesn't just stop there. We manage a $260 billion pension system. So we own shares of, corporate America. And, we know that if you have diverse boardrooms and diverse C-suites and diverse workforce, you will perform better. And that helps our retirees, people who have given their life to public service and deserve to retire in dignity. So we have a real authority to weigh in and push companies to have better workplace practices and diversity and opportunity. And so we've launched major initiatives to diversify the corporate boardroom, and to give share owners like our public pension system more say in that regard. And so we've put a lot of emphasis there, and our chief diversity officer helps promote and educate on that work and help shape that work. What are the right questions to be asking, advising and strategizing with the people that do that work to make sure they're not just accepting the status quo, that they're pushing to the next level. How we hire managers, how we hire staff, how we train staff, how we mentor. It could even be in the development of our, we try to do in our office a lot of thought leadership and be an agent of change in our public policy as a city. And if you're not listening to diverse voices, diverse communities, you're going to be proposing things that are more limited in how they help our broader community. And so we've seen that this role should be a part of everything we do, not just hiring or HR, not just in the supply chain. So I would argue that it provides immense value in every component of what you do. And there's always, I think that empowering that footprint and giving them access to all the information and authority to push for that change is, goes hand in hand.
Elena, could I ask you to elaborate a little bit on one of the interesting things that were unique about the Comptroller's office is that because the CDO role did not exist, it wasn't a budgetary item. So it wasn't something that you can just say, oh, this can go here and tell HR to fill this out. So could you talk a little bit about how you handled making it sustainable in the budget?
Yeah. So I think that we knew from day one that we couldn't just expect the city or the mayor to fund us because it had not existed before, and that we can make a stronger argument if we self-funded it. So we examined our agency budget and prioritized the resources necessary to build out this team, and then built out the work of the group. And after that successful endeavor, then went back to OMB and the Mayor's Office of Management and Budget and said, look at what we're producing, look at what we're achieving. This should be a permanent part of the agency budget and not something that is at the whim. Obviously every controller, every public leader will have their own priorities, but if we could embed the funding into the everyday of the organization, you would have a better success of it being sustainable and outliving your term. And so we did. It took us some years to do that, but I think it's been critical, even internally, to the legitimacy that other department heads view the role. And now it's become like a default part of what they do because they know it's not some transient endeavor. And so it's been really successful and really important to do that.
Yeah, I think that's really critical because at least in our travels, as our team talks to other chief diversity officers, that is one of the challenges for a lot of people trying to figure out how to do this. It's like, well, it's never been done before. So how do you begin on a blank slate? So for those of you listening, I think that you have questions around that. Please feel free to note it down. We'll answer questions later. But to me, that's one of the most critical points of longevity and sustainability. Let's go ahead and go to the next. So many times we get asked to find other chief diversity officers, or do you know someone that is looking? If there's, sometimes we find people who are looking for other chief diversity officers, but they're not sure what they should look for. So we wanted to answer this question for some of you who have asked this in the past and are probably on. One of the top characteristics that we believe really makes a great chief diversity officer is someone who has a sense of consistency, diplomacy, ability to successfully facilitate and build coalition, creativity and innovative thinking, ability to start from scratch. And of course, there's some don'ts around not being defeated easily. But I left this one for last. I didn't mention it right away because to me, it's been a very critical point in doing the work for the last 8 years. And it's really the concept of being comfortable with making other people uncomfortable, being comfortable in uncomfortableness. And I'm not sure if that's a saying or if it exists, but I would say that this work is not easy work. And many times I've been at a table with Elena, but we'll have to talk to other colleagues, or we just have to figure something out that has never been done before. And it can be very uncomfortable. And I have found that having the characteristic and the culture in an office that can sustain that makes staying at a job and staying at this path, staying in the CDO path, a lot more rewarding. So I'm going to ask Elena to talk a little bit about that, about the concept of being comfortable being uncomfortable.
Yeah, I mean, we have so many stories, Wendy and I, of, I could, one example would be like in our IT department, and how we select certain vendors. And these are naturally, particularly in the controller's office, they're naturally risk adverse people. They don't want to make a mistake. It comes from a good place of, that's not how I've ever done it. I've never seen anyone do it that way before. And so you want to do what you know that can work and that is safe, because you want to protect the integrity of the agency, and it comes from a good place. But I think the more Wendy in particular and myself having to back her up at times, say to people, just take a breath and just answer, are we allowed to do it this way? Well, okay, if these are obstacles, what could solve for those obstacles? Oh, okay, you need more people with this certification. Who certifies? What's the process? Like, oh, you need to do this. Well, could we do that? And just like a lot of inquiry, and making those business leaders or operational leaders partners in what you're doing. So it's not like you're doing something to them. You're saying, let's figure this out together. And if we ultimately, determine this is not permissible or not appropriate, we won't do it. But allowing the space to explore an entirely new or different way to do something, to allow for more opportunity, more competitiveness. And I have to say, almost always, maybe even always, we have found our way there. But to Wendy's point, the initial series of conversations, often I'm not in, can be quite tense, because they see this person that's separate from their bureau and separate from their scope of responsibility, challenging them on how they've done business. And it can feel threatening and judgmental, but you have to have the right demeanor. And Wendy, comes with warmth, and respect. And I think it's the kind of thing that over these many years, I think people have learned, oh, I see, they're never going to put me in harm's way, but they are going to push me to think differently. And they've seen it work again and again and again. So now you would talk to those same people and they would say, you know what, let's look into that, like, more readily, because they've been through it. And when you're starting from scratch and you don't have those toned muscles, and it can be hard. And it's not for everyone. I think there are people that really struggle to push that way. And that's why I think in a lot of ways, having a CDO that is at the seniority of some of the other operational leaders can really help. It shouldn't always require that, but it can really help.
100%. I would also add that it's one of the most beautiful things that have come out of this is that the same people, maybe when you first start, when the whole room was uncomfortable, will be the first people to proactively suggest something 1 month and 2 months later, because the ideas are not always coming from the chief diversity officer, and they shouldn't always come from the chief diversity officer. They really should come from the experts. And we'll talk a little bit about how you begin to foster that at your organization. Here, I just wanted to provide, we get this question a lot. People just want to know, like, hard facts, like, well, what do you look for in a chief diversity officer? We talked about all the characteristics and like what kind kind of toughness you should look for. But there's some practical things that you can definitely ask people on an interview process. I think if someone has a sense of if they've done equal EEO practices, which is equal employment opportunity, those are nice spaces to find people, because it's already saying they initially have some practice implementing operations around diversity and inclusion. You want to find people who have some background in supplier diversity as well. I'm not saying that these all have to be mutually exclusive. They can exist separately as well. You also want to make sure that the person has worked with underserved communities and anti-racism work. It's an understanding of institutional oppression and identifying racial and gender gaps through data and statistics. And you want to make sure that this person has the education level and the industry experience that allows you to have them in the C-suite. This is super, super critical because it really requires a high level experienced manager to do this. This is not a programmatic role. It's a C-suite role for those of you in the private sector. If you're an agency and you're watching, it's a cabinet role. And so I guess I want to highlight really quickly here before moving to Elena is that if you're watching and you're a person of color or you're a woman, many times it's important to understand that being comfortable in all the aspects of who you are also plays a role in this. And a lot of times, as people of color, we ourselves may be feeling a little tormented, like, oh, should I always push for this particular group or should I always push for that particular group? The answer is yes, that's your job. The most empowering part of this job is that you get to push for people who look like you and sound like you, and for those who don't look like you and sound like you. So there's a lot of empowerment that comes with that, but there's a lot of self-work that comes with that as well. So I always encourage people that you should also keep reading. Some books that helped me along the way, they were not tangible, but helped me as I was looking at things from a certain perspective, is Brown is the New White, The Color of Money, Black Banks and Racial Wealth Gap. I did a lot of work with minority banks, and that helped me give me perspective when I was looking at the numbers. The McKinsey and Company report on why diversity in the workplace matters. Look at our report, Making the Grade. It'll give you a beautiful overview for the last 8 years on how much money the city spends on women and minority-owned businesses. And then there's None of Us is as Good as All of Us. It's done by the McDonald's former chief diversity officer, and some best practices that Patricia found along the way as well. You don't have to pick these, but it's just items that helped me as well. Elena, could you talk a little bit around more the concrete tasks and standards as you were putting them together? Some things that were added in the first job description that maybe, or things you wish you could have, I should say things you wish you could have added, like knowing what you know now.
Yeah, I mean, I think formalizing the role of the chief diversity officer in our decision-making, particularly with our own supply chain, how we hired and selected vendors. I think we learned over time that like structuring that and making it, you need an actual signature from our chief diversity officer if we're not going to achieve a certain goal. Again, doesn't mean we never put the operations of the agency at risk, and we always, made sure that we were honoring our mandates, our fiduciary mandates or our charter mandates. But as deputy controllers understood that our chief diversity officer was a step in the process, and they would have to account for how they, own the accountability of their process in selecting vendors. It made people sit up a little straighter and make sure they put every single ounce of effort into it, and knowing that the data around our operations were regularly reviewed. There were regular meetings held by and between our chief diversity officer and key operational leads of the office. Again, it wasn't like Wendy in her capacity was supervising them, but they knew that she was meeting with me every single week. And if we were struggling on something, I was going to know. And again, we're a team, we're partners, but I think having that sort of tangible structure to how we communicate and how we make decisions, we refined and sort of baked in as the years went on. And I, had I known all those things, I would have done that right away. So I hope that answers your question, but, finding ways to make people feel that they have to be transparent and forthcoming with their data, with their results, that was going to be readily shared with Wendy and our diversity team.
Yeah, that's excellent. Very well put. We're going to go ahead and go to the next slide, which talks a little bit about what Elena just talked about, which is reporting. So now you've hired your CDO and you want to set them up for success. And so what do you do? So we want you to learn from what we've learned. That way you get it up front. Remember, we did this 10 years ago. It's very different from now. There's a lot more information out there on how to do this. So just a few things. You want to make sure that you're collecting data now. Whether you have a CDO or you don't have a CDO, it's important you collect data about gender, about race, about ethnicity, around whether you have LGBTQ, disability, your workforce, your vendors, your board, your leadership. And it may sound daunting right now. It may sound like, why do I want to do all these things? But it's going to be important, not just for your CDO, but for the full operations and for you as a leader to know, one, if the CDO is doing a good job and making sure that they're giving you the recommendations that require growth, and for the CDO to understand where they can begin. Of course, if you don't have that when you hire the CDO, you can do that together. But these are things that if you wanted to, you can begin that now. You want to ensure that they're reporting directly to the CEO, president, or if you're an agency, commissioner, or mayor, if you're in City Hall and you're watching. This was critical for both Elena and I. As we met, the more we discovered, the more we realized there was more to do. And then some things we decided to do later, some things we decided to do in the short term. And Elena, I'll ask you to talk a little bit about that as I finish the rest of the points. You want to allow time for your CDO to understand the ins and outs of the organization. For example, if their colleagues have oversight of a certain decision and why, and what's behind those decisions. That kind of scavenger hunting is critical to the role being able to move the agency into another realm. And then you want to be clear to your full team that they're going to be collaborating with the CDO and that the CDO, along with the team member, will be accountable. So Elena, could you talk a little bit about how you felt reporting helped you in your role as you were listening to everybody on the team, and in this case, the CDO, right? And also talk a little bit about the role of CDO collaborating with the full team, because you really got to see from a helicopter point of view when I would bring something to you and then another team member would express a concern as well. Can you talk a little bit about what happens there?
Yeah, it was really interesting. So I would say, it depended on the issue. Sometimes I would hear, I would meet with Wendy and she would bring me up to speed on priorities or, current challenges. And then I would separately and subsequently meet with a deputy controller that she was engaged with, and I would hear it from their perspective. And because I was educated and prepared by Wendy, I understood where the push and pull was, and I could listen, but then help ensure that we drove to a solution. And I think, again, like we all, in my role as first deputy, I have many responsibilities. Diversity and inclusion will always be a paramount goal and priority, particularly of my boss, the controller, but everyone will accept and forgive that I'm going to get distracted doing 25 other things. And so if we did, if that diversity initiative was delayed by a month, they're not looking at me saying you failed, right? Or that you disappointed us. because you're the first deputy, you're so busy. Like, and same thing with every one of our deputy controllers, like, oh, you're overseeing accounting, or you're overseeing the, Bureau of Asset Management, like, oh, you're so busy. And so easily these things can just slide and slide and slide. And having that direct line of reporting, and I knew that every single week Wendy was like, gotta move, gotta go, gotta get that thing done. And and my job was to support her and so, oh, you're having a problem, you're not hearing back with from so-and-so, or you're not getting the logistical support you need, or you're not getting the data you need, or you're not getting the decision you need. Like, she just plated that stuff for me, and I could be that support, knock it down, get it done, and move forward, and things just leaped forward. And then similarly, us being accountable to the comptroller himself, and him being apprised and briefed, he would ask smart questions, he would push, he would have ideas. And had all of that flow of information not been in place, you can start to see how things kind of slide down. And, there's so many components that make these kind of dynamics successful, but I think, I know that has really helped, that Wendy had full and complete focus, and her success was whether these things meant that they advanced, because that was her ownership. And even if you have an entire leadership cabinet who's like bought in and they care very deeply about these issues, they have other responsibilities. And so, yeah, I think that clarity of ownership is critical.
Definitely. So we'll go to the next slide, and we'll talk a little bit about the plan, because I think you heard Elena talk about this earlier, which is how do you operationalize? And I'm sure many of you are thinking, oh, how do you operationalize this? Like, what does the day-to-day look like? So we'll talk to you a little bit about how do you create a growth plan for your own office, just some set items that we found helpful. First thing you want to do is you want to set diversity goals across boardroom, workforce, and suppliers. Just do it from the beginning, guys. Just get it done. Have that be your first week conversation. Elena and I are happy to help you offline and talk you through how to do this, so that you don't have to spend all the excruciating hours figuring out. The formula is not that different. Most industries, the same thing applies with some tweaks. You also want to create an internal and external board of experts. Very, very important. You want to be able to have your experts inside of the office, in all your bureaus or in all your departments, depending on where you work. And then you want to have outside folks that are impacted by the work that you do. Why is this important? The external folks will keep you accountable in ways that you won't even realize you needed. The external folks are also impacted by what you do, so they will know if what you're doing actually works or didn't work. If you've done all these things as an internal team, and Elena and I are high-fiving each other, and the people outside and the constituents of New York City are not out there telling the comptroller, hey, I was at your office and this happened, then we really have not done the work for the people who we came to do it for. If you're at a corporation, then it means your customers. It's the same formula for both private and public sector. You want to make sure that you have an internal, that you're looking at internal policy barriers that limit access to women and people of color. The readings are very important that we recommended earlier, because they're going to give you a sense of what historical laws have been put in place in every institution, government, private sector, that are innate racist laws, so that when you see them at your organization, you're not saying, oh, it's the Department of Contracts, or it's the Department of Pensions, or it's marketing. It's not that. There's some things that exist that have been put here that have clear, that are racial, they're systemically racist. So if you get a sense of that background, then you'll be able to eye it. And then you can go to, in your case, if you have an Elena in your office, you can go to the head of the office and say, this one is our office, it's bigger than our office, but we need to address it for these reasons. You want to be able to do some quick changes, long-term and short-term, very, very important. You want to make sure that tasks and standards of your leadership reflect accountability to diversity goals. That means everyone that applies to work at your office should have a sense of what diversity in your office is doing. If you don't have that, then you can begin to have that conversation. And then you want to set the tone for the industry. I think my sense is being a CDO, you're not just CDOing it for your office. I don't know if that's a word. It's my word. I use CDOing it. You don't want to CDO it just for your office. You also want to do things that are going to help your colleagues and the industry. And many times it may be something that no one's ever, like you ask someone, hey, have you done this? And they're like, never. And you may find 10 other people that tell you never, and you do it anyway. And then you have the backing of your office to get it done. And if you fail, that's okay, because at least you've tried it and you know it didn't work. But you can't be scared of doing that. And the way you do that is by measuring growth. When you begin to measure growth in numbers and data, you'll figure out if your weird ideas are making sense or not. And that really means that you have to institute a schedule and a system of regular reporting on individuals, on each department. You have to be meeting with your colleagues constantly. You have to require and give your office an annual report. I had to give Elena reports frequently and show when the numbers went up and down, and we have that in the system. And Elena, if you could talk a little bit about that. And the numbers at the end will speak for themselves. So Elena, can you talk a little bit about how the numbers speak for themselves? And then can you also talk a little bit about how important tone was throughout the office?
Yeah. So, I mean, numbers don't lie, right? Hopefully if they're accurate and they're real time. I think the best, I mean, there's a lot of examples of this, obviously with our annual grade book, agency by agency, looking at their actual spend with MWBE vendors. You know, there were specific goals by category. We were giving periodic updates throughout the year to agencies. Like, they had everything they needed to know that you need to hone in and look at what's going on. And that kind of real-time data, looking at that regularly with Wendy and our operational leads, we would sit down and say, why are we struggling so much in this? And we were able to like tunnel in and then go back out, and tunnel in and go back out. And we did it constantly. And so my head of administration, my head of IT, our head of, you know, the controllers, different, like, they had to be at that table and answer for this with us. So it wasn't just our CDO pushing, it was like, what's going on? And not with a blame. It's just like, okay, we're a team. How do we figure this out? Okay, we have X many months left to hit the goal that we have. What can we do? And forcing everyone to feel the shared accountability of that. Similarly, obviously for hiring, the controller, we were regularly meeting with the controller about the diversity of our new hires, of our promotions, of just the general composition of our teams. And so when you saw that certain bureaus, again, not because of, I don't think it's because of malicious, you know, it's someone trying not to, it's just when you drove the accountability, when you were sitting with those deputy controllers and saying, look, you have no one of color in this entire sphere, what are you going to do about it? They knew, like, they couldn't fail. They couldn't ignore that anymore. And so when there's that data and you pair it with support and collaboration, that you're going to link arms and help them. So it's not just, here's a problem, fix it. It's, here's a problem, here's every single support you could possibly need to fix it, and we're going to strategize with you till we get there. And then we're going to report back on whether we got there. And if we did, you know, celebrate that. And if we didn't, unpack why. You know, and I would go back just quickly to the board of experts, which I think people might skip over out of fear of that pressure and interaction, but I think that's critical. And I think Wendy and her team have done an excellent job. It's not that those board of experts spell everything out for you, but it's an important antenna that really tells you, oh, I got to step up here, or there's a whole area that I have not been focusing on that maybe we need to deepen our work in. And so it keeps you on your toes, and it allows you to go back to your commissioner, your executive director, or your president, and say, and show that you have an understanding of the landscape and where you need to go next, and present a vision along with the role. which is great because you're a creative partner.
Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about some best practices on what you can do in the next few months. You can have a written statement from the CEO, a president, promoting diversity policy as a business strategy. You can establish diversity point persons within each business unit or department. And it doesn't mean that they're doing what the CDO is doing. It means that they are collaborators with the CDO within that area of expertise. You can develop written and measurable guidelines and goals for company-wide diversity strategy, and you'll have macro goals and micro goals. You can memorialize organizational changes in writing with both the CDO and the CEO. This is going to be critical. Elena highlighted this earlier, which is how do you make sure that things happen? Well, you create accountability around it and you put it in writing. That's business 101. And you can establish a culture of equal acceptance and appreciation for diversity skills and backgrounds. You can build relationships with external stakeholders. And of course, always solicit women and people of color for all opportunities, whether that's procurement, whether that is hiring, whether that's the boardroom, and stay informed and engage with communities directly impacted by your decisions. So this is just re-highlighting of what we just talked about in terms of very clear bullets. Elena, do you want to add anything to that? I wanted to see if, would you like, Elena, could I prompt you very quickly? Could we talk a little bit about, because I think this was a critical point in a turning point for us, but in memorializing organizational changes and writing from both the CEO, the CDO, the sign off, I feel like that was a really critical point as we were making everything more structured. Can you talk about the feedback you got and what you saw differently after we began to do sign-offs?
Yeah, I think it made the deputy controllers and our sort of bureau heads feel more comfortable and less resistant to do what we were asking them to do, because it was part of a formal practice that everyone was adhering to, and it had been vetted by legal, and it had been thought through with our procurement experts and budgetary experts. And so there was sort of a legitimacy. It wasn't just, hey, you should be consulting and making sure XYZ happens. It's like, as a default, you can't go to the next step until you've had this meeting with our chief diversity officer. And we know that it's permissible and we know that it's appropriate because we've done exhaustive research on the rules of the road. And so I think that was, it made kind of a shocking difference in terms of routinizing all these best practices. It wasn't this optional, if you're in the mood, if you have the time. It's like, this is what we do. Is that kind of what you were thinking?
And I would say that's what got us. We'll talk a little bit about accomplishments later, but when we first got in here, we were about $2 million with women and minority owned vendors. And now we got to almost 9 million. So I think that really was the big shift. What made us like the big move was when we had in writing different levels of accountability that everyone had to sign off on. And by the way, for those of you listening, I wish I could take the credit for that idea, but it wasn't. It came from other team members. People were dying to have this in writing. This was not something that came from the diversity team. It actually came from our experts. Like, please, can we just have this in writing? It would make us more comfortable. So your organization will ask for the things they need when you open up the floor for them to be creative around it. Okay. In the controller's office, we already talked about this, but very quickly, the way we view the CDO's role is that it's part of the work of the fiscal watchdog of the city, which is it's in the controller's office that is an independent elected accountable for all New Yorkers, and it has a national impact on corporate America. Elena talked about this earlier, and so we do everything through that lens. In your organization, think about what your authorities are and how that chief diversity officer will do it through that lens, because it does change depending on how you do your work. Some accomplishments, I'm going to pass this slide to Elena to talk a little bit about why does this work, Elena? How do we know that it's worked for us and through all our endeavors?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is just a sampling of sort of where we've seen the numbers change and for the better. So every single year since we've been in office, we've graded most city agencies. And I think when we started, only 4.9% goes to MWBEs. That's 21 billion out of a $21 billion budget. So we're still there, correct? Or this is where we landed?
Sorry, we are still there. We're still there.
Yeah. So, but we've seen agency by agency real improvement. We've seen some backsliding. I think it's like you have to constantly be managing and holding that, looking at that accountability and offering how we can troubleshoot improving these numbers. But that's been something that we're extremely proud of, because developing the grading mechanism and publishing this kind of analysis, it's not, and for such a large city as New York, it took a lot of work to develop that and to keep producing that. And it's sort of a marquee product that I think people look to, throughout the whole city. And then I spoke about this briefly earlier, but the Boardroom Accountability Project. So basically it was, we're basically saying that if you own shares of these companies or a certain amount of shares, that we should have the right to nominate women and people of color or anyone to the board. Typically a lot of board appointments are made because of who you golf with, or, this sort of insular world. Most boards are made up of white men. And so because of this multi-year project, we now have seen 77 more women and people of color on corporate boards. And we've also been very successful at pushing companies to require that women or people of color are considered or included in search for CEO positions, and publish the data on their diversity. So that's, that transparency and that process inevitably will lead to more opportunity. We've also seen, this is in our own agency.
Yeah, and I'll jump in on this one. And also we've seen spending, we talked a little bit about this earlier, which is when we first got in, we saw about 13% of our money going, our vendors, going to women and minority owned businesses. And you hear the comptroller talk about this all the time. If you watch someone, he's like, we have to take a look at ourselves. You couldn't go out and say, dear Mayor de Blasio, you're not doing your job if our own agency was suffering. So he came to us and was like, we need to build this up. And I want to be proud of a number that represents the city of New York. And those are wonderful meetings, as you remember, Elena, sitting in a room with the comptroller and him asking the questions of why are numbers so low when we first got there. So we knew we had to get to work, and it was going to be a big project. We had to move all bureaus. We're at 9 million now. It's out reported at 7.4 million, but you'll see it coming in the next couple months. And we've invested about $1 billion in minority investment firms. We do that every single year, and every single year we up it. Every single year we've seen a growth of about 88% with investors. We've asked people to develop growth plans. We've advocated for CDOs across the city. And this is the one I want to talk about just more concretely, and that for the last 8 years, we spent our time just saying, hey, the CDO thing in the comptroller's office, it works. So why don't we just do this everywhere for the city of New York? But that required a lot of work. It required a lot of moments at the Charter Revision Commission, asking for the city to include chief diversity officers, and making sure that the comptroller was in front of the commissioners for the charter revision, asking for this. The comptroller had to lobby for CDOs to exist across the city. And then we finally, after 8 years, saw it last year during the pandemic, was last summer. I think Elena and I both cried that day. We were very happy. So Elena, can you talk a little bit about the moment we were able to have CDO and maybe the challenges along the way? Because I think you were really close to all the aspects.
No, I mean, I think it's one of those things where, you know, people need to be convinced that it's worth the resources that it can have, the like that. Oh, why can't we just have our MWBE officer that's, you know, that's not necessarily part of the senior cabinet level team function in that capacity? What's the difference? I think people were very skeptical. And, you know, again, we've talked at length about this, but just the importance of that senior level accountability and ownership. And so the controller felt very passionately that we should make that argument every opportunity we could. And obviously, I think the broader community is crying out for that, as the data shows. You know, we have a lot more progress to make as a city. And we know that diverse firms hire more diverse talent, and that creates wealth in diverse communities, and the research is irrefutable. So I think we're extremely excited to see movement there, and but we have to make it real. And that would be a disservice to the work that we all collectively want to accomplish if it's in name only, but we don't empower and invest and prioritize. And so that's sort of what fuels this presentation in part, is we feel very passionately that we know this works, and we want to see it be made real. And, you know, in the way that we've engaged, just pivoting for a second on the pension system, is, you know, when you demand, you know, there's things that we've demanded of the money managers that are selected, the financial managers that are selected to invest our pension dollars. If it's simply just asking them, can you just disclose to us, just disclose how many people share profits in your firm that are women or people of color? How many are in the C-suite, or how many make, you know, above a certain amount of money? Like, just disclose it. I recall early on conversations that were like, literally no one will ever do business with the city of New York again. You will destroy. I mean, it was like to that level of like, you cannot do this. You cannot. And then you do it, and everyone complies. And then everyone's motivated for their numbers to look better. And it's like just the act of disclosure. So I've been convinced the power of accountability and data. Obviously, you always want the mandate and the codified rulemaking, but at minimum, just showing people that you're watching and that you're looking and you're going to inquire alone can have a huge impact.
Yeah, definitely. Those were my favorite moments. And then watching the controllers be like, we're doing it. Sorry you feel that way. Why don't we go to the next slide? We're towards the end. People always ask for advice. What is your advice as a chief diversity officer? What have you learned in the last few years? So here's my advice. My advice is, you need to be comfortable making people uncomfortable. Please be comfortable. Be comfortable in your own skin, so that when you have to get in other people's skin, you know the difference between yours and theirs. Being a CDO requires lots and lots of patience. It also requires lots of time, lots of consistency, and an understanding that you win some, you lose some, but you always win in the end. You have to make it work, not just for you. It's not about being chief diversity officer. It's about making sure that you're creating sustainability in the long term. And it's also about making sure that you're breaking racial barriers. There's real systemic racism exists across every single part of life, whether it's the food that you eat, how you access it, or the homes that we live in. This is very real. It is part of our society. I think we all know it by now. We are at a different level of consciousness. So you have to make sure that what you're doing is setting a trend for trailblazing through your title. Do not hold tight to the concept of chief diversity officer. Hold tight to breaking racial barriers. And for those of you doing it, you will see lots of momentum around that. For those of you hiring people, doing it, grip on the same way, and you'll see that there will be not a lot of good collaboration on pulling the evolution. Removing any barriers that negatively impact women and people of color. Very important. That means any barrier, from the bathroom people go to everything, to vendors that you do business with. And I think this is something, this is the fourth one, and it embodies Elena so much. And I want to say this in front of all 61 participants that we have here, and anyone else that's watching. I think we'll have hundreds of people watching when we put this out live. Elena has had my back in every single instance that we are in a uncomfortable situation. But not just my back, she has our whole team's back, and she takes the time to really look at consistency and understand that there are growing pains in this position, not just for the CEO, but for the organization as a whole. So if you are leading an organization, you're thinking about hiring a CDO, the first thing I would say is important, something that I felt it coming in that Elena did for me, is having your CDO understand that that you have their back. That makes the day so much easier. Just remember that as people of color doing this work, and because most of the time it's either a woman or a person of color doing this work, or LGBT, or just a disenfranchised, someone who's coming from a disenfranchised community, this work is exhausting. And a lot of people don't like to talk about how you can take it personal. Many times I took it personal. Many times if I was in front of someone and they said they didn't want to do something, I felt like they were saying no to me, the Hispanic Dominican woman. And that can be emotionally exhausting. And so the beauty and the great part of that is that you have your moment, and then you realize that everyone in your organization has your back, and that this work takes time, and there's so much more rewards later. So just make sure that as you're doing this work, you are readily available for the growing pains. And because when you reap the rewards, they're very nice. Doing 9 million with vendors is a huge legacy and accomplishment that we're going to be leaving at the Comptroller's office. Getting an A grade for the last 3 years in our office is a huge accomplishment. Giving $1 billion to MWBE is a huge accomplishment. And that is just the standard bar. The next Comptroller is going to have to take it to the next level. Elena, you have closing remarks, thoughts and ideas before we move to questions.
I mean, obviously I have so much, I've learned so much working so closely with you, Wendy, over these years. And I feel so lucky and fortunate to have had this collaboration and partnership. And just as much as she felt like I was there for her, I felt so supported. I'm backed up by Wendy. And I knew that I was lucky to know that whatever was driving Wendy came from the right place and the good place and a smart place. And she never, her passion and drive never waned. So we all benefited from that leadership, that vision. So wow, I'm like, who gets
We're emotional. We're emotional.
I know. But I agree with everything that Wendy said, and it has to really happen on all levels. And but I think that if there's collective accountability and you prioritize it, there's so much you can do, and it's so tangible and it's really rewarding. And so we're happy to be a resource and create space for this discussion, and encourage everyone to be inquisitive and stay engaged.
Okay, so this is the time where we're going to open it up for questions. Kevway on our team is going to read the questions on the chat out loud, and then we will attempt to answer all of them on here. I believe there's only 4 or 5, so
yeah,
I could be wrong.
So the first question that we have is, thank you so much for this presentation. How do you balance putting your foot down when you come against racial inequalities with dealing with an inevitable backlash from those who don't want to give up power, knowing that they have the power to tear down your organization?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say the best way to deal with that is data. There have been many circumstances in our office where where I didn't have the data, I didn't feel as empowered to bring up the issue. Just personally, I had to think about it twice. Like, how was I going to express racial inequity without really having numbers? So that really that motivated me to really get a better understanding of how my colleagues made decisions. If you can immediately in your organization, if you're asking because you want to be a chief diversity officer, you're already a chief diversity officer, please get access to the data, because that will allow you to speak from a place of evidence.
Okay.
Any want to chime in? Any thoughts there?
No, but it's like, even if there's no data to be had, you can still gather like information about process and say, maybe it's around hiring. It's like, okay, where did you post? How did you select who you were just like ask a lot of questions about who decided, who sat in on the interview, what questions did you know, and then be able to say, well, here are like 6 best practices, again, all from a place of information, that recommend that you post at minimum or you have this many people in interviews, or you look at resumes, you know, do blind resumes, or there's different strategies. And like, I'm not saying, you know, obviously, ultimately you need the support from your leadership to back you up. But I think people appreciate that you've done your homework and that you're coming at it from a place of learning and sharing, you know, to help get people more bought into what you're trying, you know, to what everyone's collectively trying to achieve.
Okay, our next question is, can you speak on whether, hold on, sorry. Can you speak more on how you compose a board of experts, both internal and external? What are you looking for and how you assemble them?
Yeah, definitely. I would say it's unique for every organization. So I'll give you an example. In our office, the people impacted by the work we do was a combination of folks who were advocates in the pension world, because we have such a large pension fund. We're the 4th largest in the nation. So we knew that we needed to make sure to involve those organizations that represented women and people of color in the pension world, right? That was clear. We also have lots of procurement and vendors that we buy. And part of that was making sure that people who did diversity work around businesses and women-owned companies and companies that were owned by those groups have to be represented. So on ours, just to give you an example, we have an advisory board that involves New America Alliance, that involves NAIC, which is the Investor Association, that involves the Hispanic Federation, that involves Contractors Union, and it has so many different people, involves the LGBTQ chamber, the disability chamber, that are impacted by our decisions. So I would say the best way to describe it is look at your mission for your organization, see who are the intended people that are to be impacted, and then couple that with organizations that represent people of color in those sectors. I don't know, Elena, do you want to talk a little bit about, because the advisory board, I think, was something, I really came from the Comptroller. It's something that he wanted to do ASAP.
Yeah, I mean, you know, again, like every organization is different. I think we were very inclusive and very broad. So trying to get people in different industries. There might be umbrella groups that represent IT or represent construction or represent different, you know, dimensions of the vendor community you might be engaging. It might be academic, like people who do research or, you know, have a pulse of where the latest thinking is on something. So you might want that dimension. you might want advocacy, just people who are just very immersed in the grassroots and in the community and can offer that perspective. So I'm trying to think of what else. So, I mean, and then I think it evolved year after year. Like there'd be some people that cycle off, some people that are a little more dormant, they're there, but they're not. And then you're noticing, oh, like there's some people I'm seeing at conferences, I'm getting phone calls from, like they would be great to be at the table. And so it's not a static thing. It's something that you're gonna learn and develop and foster a year after year. And then you bring them together, and the Comptroller Stringer, Wendy, regularly did presentations, you know, to engage them on what we were doing. And so you might think, well, why do they care? Like they're working in this industry, they don't care about what the control, but it really kept them connected to the work. And so then in their professional travels, they might hear about something and go, oh, I know Wendy or the Comptroller just talked about that, or just was working on that, and it would kind of create a feedback loop. And then, so there were opportunities to make them feel more invested in what we were doing, and also benefit from their knowledge that they're learning about in their respective disciplines. So it's a process. Like you have to really spend some time thinking about it. It's not, we didn't do it overnight. It took us some time.
Okay. Our next question is, what kind of metrics would you require each department to establish?
Can you say that again?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, what kind of metrics would you require each department to establish?
Okay. This is an interesting question because metrics should be established based on availability. And basically what that means is it's almost like you have to start backwards. You should get a sense of how many women and minority-owned businesses, or how many employees, or how many potential board members, whatever the topic is, exist in the industry area that you're looking for. So for example, there were some that when we were establishing goals for our office, we have fluid goals because availability changes with time. So for example, if we were looking for search firms at some point, and there were only, I'm just making this up, and there were only 2 search firms in the world, period. And we had examples like that. And so there were no women or minority-owned firms that were search firms. This is not accurate, but I'm just giving you a sense of like this has happened where you know, there's a business that monopolizes all the other business. We would then come up with innovative ideas on how they can utilize women and minorities within their work. If there was an IT where we had to buy everything from Microsoft, because for Microsoft is Microsoft, or Dell, and you had to get Dell. It's not like there is a minority Dell or a minority Microsoft. We would talk through how they can utilize distributors. So I guess the short answer is really it varies based on industry and availability. I'll be happy to talk through with you for the person that asked the question on how you can look at availability. There are ways to take a look at that. There's professional associations, and then that will give you a sense of what your goal is. But they shouldn't be static. They should never, ever be static, because there can be 10 people in an industry one year, and then the next year there will be 40. You know, so those are, you don't want to create static goals.
And I would just say that, like, you might realize you want data that you don't have, and you can actually hire a vendor or develop infrastructure to start counting those things or tracking them. And so it depends on the capacity of your organization, but you can also be sort of a leader in pushing for the administration to start tracking or start measuring things they had never before done. Yeah, so I think that, and I would also say that Wendy and her team regularly did focus groups with individual minority and women-owned businesses, and we've learned a lot from those. Not me, because I'm not in them, but our team has learned a tremendous amount from just one-on-one conversations. Like, you might be on with one singular MWBE in a specific industry who's complaining that they can never compete or apply for something because of these 3 requirements. And then Wendy or her team would take that back and say, why do we have these requirements? And do we need them? And are they required by law? You know, like what would happen if we stopped doing that? Like, and just a lot of learning and inquiry. And then that would lead to, well, let's do a pilot, or let's try this, or let's bring the whole industry in and like, ask them. And like, you know, there would be like, it would send us down a path of how do we, and just wanting to break down every barrier we could.
Yeah, definitely. I completely, that's right. Like, yes. Next
question is, in an organization where staff of color have historically felt underrepresented and excluded from collaborative decisions-making opportunities and have lost trust in the leadership to make racially just change, how can a CDO respond to these concerns?
Yeah, I think it's what we've highlighted earlier in the presentation, which is part of the CDO's work, specifically when it comes to HR, is to do the 3 pillars, is to work through culture, is to work through metrics, and leadership. And I think what you're talking about is many people of color and women face this, is you'll come to an organization, everyone is like super happy to have you, and then you feel isolated and you feel like, well, maybe you're the only person in IT, or you're the only person in your finance department. So there has to be a culture of retaining. I think from talking, especially through this in my own experience, I found that even in my own friendship groups, we tend to not always ask for raises. We tend not to always ask to be promoted, to sit at the table, to be part of a project. And those are things that organization can do proactively, that a CDO can bring up. If there's a pattern and there are many employees that are saying the same thing, they can say, like, we can say, okay, what are ways that we can think through, this is what Elena was talking about earlier, like what are ways that we can think through having the organization proactively ask the question of where do you want to be next, or having it be systemic. It's so important to systemize because it is a point of barrier for women and people of color. Anything that you address there also addresses the whole group. It would also benefit the full organization.
Okay, we have about 2 more questions. Our next one is, you have all done amazing work these last 8 years. When it comes to the Comptroller's office, what are you most proud of?
Elena, take it away, and then I'll what are you the most proud of?
What am I most proud of, the whole office, or specifically in our diversity work?
I would say anything. They didn't specify. So really, what is your biggest accomplishment in the last 8 years?
I mean, there's many, so I can't, what I would say that personally I'm the most proud of is amassing and assembling the most talented group of professionals I feel like in the country is right here in this office, because it's a blend of people who have deep expertise and intelligence, but are also very much good human beings. And that is so rare to have. I mean, every single component of this office, I feel that way. And how many people work in an environment where they can say that about pretty much every single person they work with. And we all challenge each other and have each other's backs. And so this culture that we've created here, and just the quality of the people, I'm so absurdly proud of that. And I hope, you know, I hope that for everybody that they can have what we've had over these many years. It's like such a treasure. And you know, so I'm proud of so many things that we've done in terms of professionalizing the office, being thought leaders in public policy, bringing rigorous attention to good government and best practice. And there's not a single piece of this office that isn't run from what is right and what is best for our, like, there's just no dysfunction. I mean, there's things we could improve, and there's always room for improvement. But that integrity and those ethics I could go on, but that I think it all goes back to the quality of the people, and I'm like really proud of that.
Yeah, I would absolutely echo all Elena's points, because working with this team has really been, it's just been amazing. We're not just saying that because we work here, but really like the smartest people I've ever worked with, the most thoughtful, and a lot of times we talk about accomplishments in like dollar amounts where we're saying like we went from 1 million to 9.5 million, which is wonderful and great, but it was really the process in getting there was much easier because of the people that were behind it. I think I would also say for me, it was really, really important that we left something behind, that like there was something that was like bigger than the office that would last beyond our administration. And so I was really happy to see when they implemented chief diversity officers across the city, to have been part of that, and know that we changed the charter for the city was just like, wow, like we made history as an office. It wasn't just some numbers or statistics, like we actually changed the course of government. Another proud moment, this was really more for my kids, was that when we went to vote in November of the year before, everyone had to vote on constitutionalizing the women and minority owned program. And I remember like filling it out and thinking like, oh, wow, this is going to be the first time in the history of New York that this program is going to be codified. And while at the time I actually was not as excited because I felt like they cheaped us out of having the chief diversity officer. This is before the CDO role has been signed executive order. It was still, it was a really proud moment for me to have my kids look at that and that I could explain to them, like, this is like, we changed the law permanently for all of government, and to have worked with like the Comptroller to make that happen, and see that at the practical level is really dope. It was just really, is really great. And it's cool to see all the chief diversity officers at all the agencies being hired now. And they're like, hey, I just started, because the work beyond that was the point. The point is that we weren't going to be the only CDOs in town, that there should be many CDOs, many people that everybody can talk to about this and doing this work, and having doing the good work of government.
And we have one last question. It is, how have you gotten the stakeholders and frontline staff to support processing change?
Processing change, you said, okay. I'm gonna pass this one to Elena, because that really is more like how do you?
I mean, I think it goes back to things we've kind of touched on a few times, is sort of rewriting the policies and practices. So it's like a requirement or sort of a standard. Here's the step 1 through step 10 of how you manage procurement, that, making it a required step to do some of the things we wanted to do to get the chief diversity officer to sign off on the process before it moved forward. So I would say from trying to get all the layers of the staff more bought in, I think that really did help. I think also just proving that it works over time. There might be resistance at first, and then you start to see, that actually worked and that was successful. And so having to Wendy's point earlier about some short-term wins and not just the long-term, having tangible things work, and seeing the outcome in the product, having people see that recruitment process that was totally different actually worked, and we got a good result. Or, okay, we're going to redesign this conference that allows for panel discussions on topics we've never explored before. And then, wow, everyone signed up and everyone was engaged, and sort of that report that people made us spend countless hours developing, people are applauding it, people are reading it, people are asking, sort of the lived experience of it. Or even this event, wow, there's 60 some odd people that came to this. These are things that motivate and excite people, and but it takes, again, like it takes time for that to really be seen and felt all the way through all the layers of an organization. I think accountability. So every bureau head felt accountability that the controller, the executive director, the president, the commissioner, whatever the equivalent is, talks about it constantly. I mean, the controller in his capacity talks about these issues everywhere he goes. He goes to conferences and press conferences, and we release products, and it's like a drumbeat that people see and that it's real, that the commitment is real. Just like any human relationship, you have to prove it and not just say it. And so we've had to make it part of everything we do in an everyday way. And I will tell you, after all these years of good work, I mean, we've just scratched the surface. There's so much more I now can look back and say we should have done in hiring, or we should have done in training, or we should have done that we didn't do, like that just, that it wasn't, again, because we didn't care. It's just, there's only so much you can think of or act on in a given period of time. And so it's a wonderful body of work, because there's always more, and you're never going to get bored. And you're going to be a part of like real discussions that are important and drive change. And so it's very satisfying. And I've learned, I had no exposure to this before being in this position. And I've learned, I mean, I'm just admitting to you all that I've learned so much, and I still have so much more to learn. And it's been quite remarkable to see it take on a life of its own. There's sort of like things that we just take for granted that Brian or Kevway or Wendy or others do that had never been done, like just weren't done. And now we do it as a matter of course. And so it's really cool to see something take on a life of its own and have its own meaning and importance. So, yeah.
Thank you. We don't have any more questions. Wendy, you can close us out.
All right, well, thank you so much for those of you who stayed on. I think we started with a strong 65 and we ended at 55. So we didn't lose that many people. Thank you for staying on for the whole time. It has been a pleasure to talk through this with the great Elena Gallagher. Thank you, Elena. I'm clapping for you and with everyone else on the Q&A. Feel free to send a little clap on the chat. Send us some good energy so we know you liked it. If you liked it, let us know. And if you didn't like it, let us know. We'll do it differently next time. That's okay too. But with that, you can reach us at diversity@comptroller.nyc.gov. We have our information listed. You can reach Kevway or Brian if you want some individual help. But we're happy to talk through any of the items we discussed with you today individually, if you would like that as well. So with that, thank you very much. We are hitting our close-off time. It's about 12:30 or so. I hope everybody enjoys. Thank you, Elena. This has been wonderful and great. This is recorded, and so if any of you missed it, you can replay it again. Thank you so much, and thank you for coming to MWBE University. Have a great time. Have a great day.